So I think maybe it's a good moment to take a turn to Buddhist philosophy, not as something abstract, but as something that has a direct application to this moment and gives us resources for how to face it. And Buddhist teachings on emptiness, which is a way of describing the Buddhist understanding of reality, normally is applied in our personal meditation practice in order to become awakened. If we understand the reality of how we exist, we will be free. And what that looks like in actual practice is that the Buddhist teachings on philosophy are either intellectual and abstract, or their application has a very personal and individual application. That we aspire to become a Buddha and inspire others to liberate themselves individually. So although it doesn't leave others suffering out, we do tend to find that suffering is treated as something personal and individual. And understanding how we exist as individuals is what is the key that will open the door for us as individuals to come out from behind the fortress of the I that we've constructed. And I want to explore what a collective application of the teachings on reality that we have from Buddhism could offer us. So what can emptiness teach us when it's applied to the structures that we have created that impose an understanding on the world, that impose an order of things on the world that we then believe exists out in the world? How can understanding the logic of that thinking and seeing its fallacy allow us to do collective work? And the form of Buddhist philosophy that I want to draw on is the school of philosophy that's called Madhyamaka, which is translated usually as middle way. And it is associated particularly with Nagarjuna, the Indian philosopher who's dated anywhere from the 1st to the 3rd century. And a way of characterizing his thought is anti-dualism. It is against the thinking that there is me here and you over there, that there is an us here and a we over there. The examples that we most often hear given against dualism is not so much us and they. Sometimes self and other does definitely appear in there, but we might be more familiar with it that samsara and nirvana are not two different things. Ultimate reality and relative reality are not two different things. But when we apply it in self and other, either an individual self or a collective self and a collective other, the idea is that they are mutually constitutive, that self is defined as not other. Right? Everything that's not other is me. And what is me is whatever is not other. And this is why when we are in interactions with particular others, the particular self that arises can be different, right? So if we are interacting with our grandparents, those of us who still have grandparents around, when we interacted with our grandparents, we were a certain self, and that self was different than the self that interacted with bullies or with a romantic partner or with a best friend. And when we travel, the others are different, and so we have an experience of ourself that's different, which is one of the things that is fascinating about travel, that we get to experience ourselves differently. And all of these are signs that we are interdependent. We don't have an existence separate from all the contexts in which we operate. Okay, and that teaching is basically in a nutshell, a way of understanding the Madhyamaka teachings that reality is not dualistic, and starting to see how the identities that we construct are essentially fictional and dependent on the other that we're bringing ourselves into juxtaposition or contrast with. And in the Madhyamaka presentation of interdependence, because this is all, in a certain sense, this is the plumbing of interdependence, or put it a little bit more nicely, it's the other side of the coin. Emptiness is the other side of the coin of interdependence. There are two ways of describing the same thing. One is to say that everything arises in an interconnected way. The other way is to say there is nothing that does not arise in this interconnected way, and therefore there are no fixed essences. So there are two different ways of saying the same thing. And one of the ways to talk about interdependence in Madhyamaka presentations is to speak in terms of three types of interdependence, or three ways of understanding or finding a way into the teachings on interdependence. One is interdependence in terms of causes and conditions. That we are interdependent because we don't arise from a single cause. If we arose from a single cause, we could say, okay, we can point to one thing that we were. Interdependence is saying every single cause is itself the result of the coming together of multiple conditions. And interdependence points to the fact that we need multiple conditions, and all those conditions work together to affect the outcome. And because every condition that's coming together to affect an outcome is itself in turn dependent on the interplay of other conditions, which in turn are interdependent on the play of other conditions. If we go back long enough, it is very fair to say any single phenomenon that we look at depends on everything. We exist the way we do right now as ourselves because of all of history prior to the moment that we are experiencing. So we can think or understand our interdependence in terms of causes and conditions. We can also think of interdependence in terms of parts and wholes. It's a second term of analysis. And we can think of it in terms of, we can look at anything and treat it as a whole. We can treat the earth as a whole. We can treat a piece of land as a whole and make a border and submit it to the planning commission or have a title to it. We can treat our body as a whole, or we can isolate a part of the body and treat it as a whole. And every whole can also be broken down into parts. So there are nothing that is ultimately a whole and ultimately a part. And when we look at a whole that exists independent of the parts, there are none. There are none. Okay, is this making a certain kind of sense? Okay, so that's the analysis in terms of parts and wholes. There's nowhere to stand. We cannot say this is inherently a part. There's no part without wholes. There's no whole without parts. And anything that we identify as a whole can also be identified as a part, because the organizing principle is coming from our mind, and we can always look at it differently. And the kind of mind-boggling, fun to think about example that's given here is, if we break up the smallest physical element in the world, the tiniest subatomic particle, which, forgive me, I can't keep up with the moving goal of what is the latest smallest part, but we take the tiniest little quark or quantum little tiny piece of energy, no matter how incredibly tiny it is, it will never be indivisible. There are no indivisible parts, no indivisible wholes, no indivisible parts, no indivisible wholes. Why? Because if we take anything that's material, it will have a left side and a right side. If we just take a quick snapshot of it, if it has physical presence, there has to be a half of it that you see when you look from the left and a half that you see when you look from the right. And the other example is that if you are like imagining pieces of paper, imagine the most infinitely small piece of paper. Maybe, you have a partless particle or something that you think is partless that's so tiny that you would need to put together 1,000,000 of them to have something that's the width of a sheet of paper. But when you traverse that piece of paper with a needle, it will go in order. It will first touch on the first tiny infinitesimal particle, and the last particle that it will touch on will be the one all the way to the right. And so if we think about it, we can never have something that exists in space that cannot analytically at least be broken down. And because it can be broken down analytically, it has parts. It has a left part and a right part. And the same goes for time. There's always an earlier part of an instant and a later part of an instant. This is just like something fun to think about. But it's another way of talking about parts and wholes as being two things that cannot exist independently. There are no real essential parts or wholes that don't have parts, no matter how tiny they are. The third way of talking about interdependence in Madhyamaka, are we okay with the parts and wholes? Does that make a basic sense? Good, some thumbs up. The third one, that is where we see what's really quite distinctive about the Madhyamaka presentation of reality, is that things are interdependent in terms of, number one, causes and conditions, number two, parts and wholes, but also in terms of the labels of the way that we who are perceiving reality are organizing it through our concepts and our names. And this is a way of saying that a tree is held together as a tree by causes and conditions. It's held together as a tree by the relationship between parts and wholes, but it's also held together as a tree in this interdependent way by the notion of tree. If there was no being that made this analytical separation between the soil and the fungal networks that the roots depend on and the tree itself, if we were not there drawing that line, there would be no natural independence of a tree. Okay? And so it's a way of saying that we are living in a world, an interdependent world, in which the field of experiences, where the field of data is infinitely divisible. We could divide up this reality anyway. The input that we could take into consideration, can be organized lots of different ways. Okay, we tend to organize through space and through time. That's our way of doing things. But we also are organizing based on what we need to survive. Okay, so things that are irrelevant to our survival don't have a lot of naming, they don't have a lot of importance. So we have ants that are relevant for us because they invade our house and because they bite us, and sometimes they, sweep through and scare the heck out of people in their cabins in the middle of the woods. That may resonate for someone out there, and I think it does. I know it does. So we have names for different kinds of ants. We have names for different kinds of bees because they pollinate. How many beetles can we name? Because they are less salient or less obviously salient to our survival. Beetles occupy, they are the largest number of species in the planet, and unless you are really a very specialized person in earth science or biology, you probably can't name more than 2, 3, right? And there are countless. So salience, what is important to us gets named. It gets attention. And not only what we need to survive, what is an opportunity or a threat to us, but also what we recognize as important. So there's, among all of the different ways we could divide up the world, how we divide up the world is based on our interests in surviving. We are interested in things that are food for us. We are less interested in things that are neither food nor poison. But also what we recognize. And an example for that could be ultraviolet rays, which were not even named for a long time because they weren't in our awareness. So we didn't track them. They weren't a significant part of our reality. We actually do need them to produce, vitamin D in our skin, and getting too much is a problem. It can harm us. But because we weren't aware of that, it wasn't a factor in the way we we structured the order of things until we became aware of it. And then we knew, oh, this is salient to us. Let's start tracking it. Okay. And so this is just a way of saying that we are creating what we call the order of things as if it existed out there without us, based on our own interests and our own awareness, this interaction between this capacity that we have to structure things and the things that interest us in the world out there. So we deploy our paradigms, we impose a structure, and then we make them appear naturalized. We think that we are just reading off reality rather than actively structuring it ourselves. And we naturalize those distinctions and those categories through representations, visual and verbal, right? By what we present, what we see, how we're taught to see, and through language. And so if we're thinking now in a context about how to address what this ecological moment is asking of us, and looking at the paradigms and the structures that we impose that have been underlying so much of the harm and so much of the exploitation and the separatist consciousness that we've been thinking about, one of the ways of thinking about that is we are employing dualistic thinking. The world is not dualistic. It is our thinking about it that is, our way of relating that is. And so understanding, in order to undo the logic of dualism, has it as a really powerful place in deep thinking and action about the climate and other crises. Now, taking all of those perspectives from Madhyamaka philosophy, for me, has been extremely helpful. But I also have to recognize that Buddhism's strength is not in the collective angle of vision. Buddhism has tended over time, it's a millennial tradition, it has made its accommodations to power structures, and so its focus is less on let's make a revolution, let's change society, let's bring down the power structures, and more on let's manage our stress, let's be more mindful, let's practice compassion, let's liberate ourselves. And that has had the effect of leaving power structures unquestioned and intact. And it's striking, if we look at Buddhist communities, how intact the power structures have been left, given how much questioning of those structures we can find in the philosophy on emptiness. And part of what we're seeing now is the result of centuries of making the necessary accommodations for that tradition to be able to continue existing and being transmitted in time. And still we have the potential for that philosophy to be applied in a way that does look at collective structures that are generating violence in the world. And when we hear Buddhist teachings on nonviolence, very often the kinds of violence that we can notice a speaker is assuming are not structural. It's personal or individual violence, right? And so I found it very helpful and just want to share with you a little bit of what I have been able to apply in my own thinking, to turn to ecofeminist philosophers and their thinking on the logical structure of dualism. And there's one thinker in particular who others have built on her thinking since then, and she was drawing on other people, but she was the writer who first kind of opened my eyes to this particular presentation, and I want to honor that by naming her, Val Plumwood, who in her book on feminism and the mastery of nature has a section called the logical structure of dualism, which has some reverse engineering of the ways that dualistic thinking works to reproduce the separation into self and other, and to manifest that separation in social structures that I found really helpful. And I just want to sort of go through them and share them with you here as something that we can build on and draw on. And so she identifies certain mechanisms that are deployed in dualistic thinking that work to create hierarchies, to create oppression of nature, what we call nature by humans, which we think are not nature, right? The configuring of these separations. And so one of the mechanisms that she identifies, she calls backgrounding. And this is in which self, and we can see it on an individual psychological and an interpersonal level, and we can see it on a larger level, that self is at the center and others relative to the self are marginalized or subordinated. We can see human beings are at the center. You know, when we tell our life story, it's pretty much all humans. We are at the center of our experiences. And whichever is placed in the position of self casts everything else into the background. Everything else is relatively less important, marginalized, or subordinated, or made insignificant. And we see this so clearly in the ways in which nature is our backdrop. We treat nature like it was the painted scenery on the stage, and what matters are the human beings moving around the stage. And that is literally what a lot of theater looks like. The terminology that we use is environment. Environment, i.e. what's around the thing that matters, which we all know which species that's going to be, right? And so putting here the important thing, self, when we have this logic of dualism, what is other is what surrounds the self and serves as its background. Okay, and this, we immediately see this makes the needs of that background subordinate and secondary, or maybe even invisible. And it also makes all that we could learn, all the forms of intelligence that what we call nature is offering us, we don't see it because it's just sort of the painted backdrop. And that is a function of dualistic thinking, according to this presentation. A second mechanism is hyper-separation, where we take self and we take other. I mean, if we think about it in group terms, we focus on what this group has, and nothing of what one group has can belong to the other. We are this and they are not this. And so we emphasize what differentiates us as if it were the most important or central or defining thing. So when we're talking about racism, we make the color of the skin the most important thing. And then we associate lots of other things with it. We divide up attributes or qualities. And we see this in gender as well. What belongs to the feminine sphere doesn't belong to the masculine sphere. And we divide up qualities, we divide up attributes, we divide up names, we divide up clothing, we divide up colors, and we emphasize, that this is not that. And in human beings, what we tend to do is we emphasize the mental part or the spiritual part or the part that's not physical about us. And we treat ourselves as if we were not animals. So, and this is one thing that is very striking to me and quite disappointing in Buddhism, is that humans and animals are considered two different realms. So there is not really this recognition that we are human animals and then there are non-human animals. And so by making this strong distinction into human and animal, we are making this hyper separation, saying that, human beings, we have intelligence, we're self-aware, we have awareness, and animals, we deny that they have all of those things. And this is, again, just a logical function of dualistic thinking. And so we have humans versus animals, we have humans versus nature. And so because of the second factor, it's hard for us to see that, of course, we're nature. Of course we are. How horrible to think that we're not, right? And yet we do. So a third piece is that the subordinate, whichever is not self, is defined in terms of lack. So we have whatever is the self is the most important, it's the central, and the other is defined in terms of deficiency. So nature lacks consciousness. Animals lack self-awareness, right? Women lack whatever. Black people lack whatever, right? And so the part in whatever this relationship of self and other is that is being placed in the subordinate position is defined in terms of lacking something essential that the center has. And that's just another function of how this operates. Then a fourth mechanism that she identifies she calls it instrumentalism or objectification, in which whatever is placed in the role of the other is understood as existing to serve the needs of the center. Okay? Is this making sense? Yeah. So when we use the term natural resources, we are saying all of that exists in service of what we've put at the center, which is ourselves. And we can see it in racialized slavery. We can see it in gender stereotypes or roles. We can see it in, many, many different relationships where we have two separate groups and we exist to be served by this other. Or if we are the other, there ends up being this sense, and we can see it on a large social scale, that certain communities' needs are placed at the center. And for class, it's just very natural that people with money would be served by the people who don't have money, as if that were a natural order of things. And the more attentive we can be to these mechanisms of dualistic thinking, the more we start to realize that we are blind to them unless we specifically start seeking them out, because they have been so naturalized through this way of thinking and all of the centuries of representations that make it all seem just natural. And the fifth mechanism that Val Plumwood identifies is the homogenation. And so what that means is we deny the internal diversity to the groups. So we emphasize the difference between the groups. We make that separation as big as we can. We are not like them. And we deny that within this group that is us, or the self at the center, we make it look like a monolithic structure. And that is going to involve stereotyping when there's a group. We treat all women are like this, all men are like this. And we use that any category as if it were something that had no internal diversity, which means we ignore the differences in order to preserve this sense of really existing as a category, and a category that is really different from others. And so this logic of dualism that we see in these different mechanisms are reproduced all the time by the way that we put our attention, what we focus on, what we don't focus on, how we manage difference, what we do with the differences that we notice. And we can apply this not just to our own individual experiences, but we can see them at work all over the place in the way we're structuring the world. And so the next step, after thinking through some of these mechanisms and getting used to detecting how we're doing them, how we're applying them, is to think about how could this be reverse engineered? How can we consciously bring some of these mechanisms, into our awareness? And so I want to just go back through them, because I know I moved sort of quickly and they deserve a much slower read, and I will try to share a link to the book and to the chapter where they could be read. So the first one was backgrounding, and I'm following her order. It could be changed around. The first one is backgrounding. The self is in the center, everything else is backdrop. The dominant group is in the center, everything else fades into the background, doesn't get noticed, doesn't become important, doesn't get represented. So we see that in Hollywood. The dominant group is what gets represented. Everyone else is, we have to have long fights to get the other groups to be represented. Then there's the hyper separation, where there's a strong emphasis on differences, and the differences are treated as essential. Everything that's in this group cannot be in that group. The qualities of that group don't belong in this group. So a binary division, and a exaggerating of the differences, and looking at elements of difference as if they were central to the identities of the two groups. So humans versus animals as if they weren't the same thing. Humans versus nature as if they weren't the same thing. Then the third one, that whatever is secondary is determined in terms of lacking the key things that the center has. So nature lacks awareness. Animals lack self-awareness or lack intelligence. Instrumentalism, where whatever group or person is placed in the center, there is this unconscious assumption and lots of social things organized around it that their needs are first. So there's a hierarchy of needs, and in our case, the human's needs are placed above all other needs, and it's sort of everything else is treated as if it existed to serve the needs of whatever is in the center. And then the fifth is to ignore the internal diversity. And we do this on a personal level too. We say, I am this. I am, this sort of person, ignoring the fact that sometimes we are and sometimes we aren't, right? And so we do that with groups. We act as if everyone in the group is basically the same. We focus on some attribute that they share and make it the most important one as a way to preserve the ideational integrity or the conceptual wholeness of that group, right? So thinking about wholes and parts, any group could be divided, but we strongly assert that no, this is a natural whole. This group is a natural whole. Humans are a natural whole. And so just So with those 5 in mind, to start imagining, and this is a task for all of us, start imagining, can we question the hierarchy of needs? Of course we can. How can we question the hierarchy of needs? How do we stop assuming that the continuation of the human species is the most valuable thing that could happen on the planet? And how do we, at the same time, start recognizing that the needs of other species are not 10 steps behind us? They could be equal. Why wouldn't they be equal, actually? Recognizing the intelligence that exists in the more than human world as a way to cut across this strong valuing and hyper separation that humans are the ones who have intelligence, and the environmental, ecological crises are going to be solved by human intelligence, the shallow ecology way of thinking, to recognizing that there are countless forms of intelligence that we need to or could be learning from as we look to face this crisis. And beyond the crisis, that we could live in a world in which we recognize the multiple forms of intelligence and learn from our non-human kin. And that could be a specific way of looking at that one element of the logical structure of dualism that is making us not recognize that we share this quality with the trees and with everyone else, which we don't recognize because we've made it a part of our identity and we're hyper separating our species from other species. This is too abstract. No? Okay. I hope not. And then consciously training ourselves to recognize the internal diversity in whatever group we're part of, in ourselves, and de-essentializing the differences between one group and other. Not treating it like we are one thing and they are something essentially different. We share, far more than what separates us. Where we put our attention, how we mentally relate to sameness and difference can make all the difference here. And I think just to kind of leave us with the final task or reflection, to think about how much suffering the imposition of these dualistic structures creates. How much suffering is a result of believing that these structures are real and natural and belong in the world. How much suffering does living through these structures create for ourselves and for all other beings? And for Buddhist practitioners to think about how much could any bodhisattva contribute in one lifetime to relieve the suffering of others by working with an individual thinking versus how much could be relieved in terms of suffering by working on this collective or structural level. I'm going to leave that as a final thought. Thanks. Let's start by connecting with our body, and we can anchor our attention in the sensation of the weight of our body. We can feel a certain weight in our arms. We can feel the weight of our head. The trunk of our body. and the collective weight of our whole body on the seat. And as we connect with the weight, we can recognize that this is what the earth element feels like. This is a direct experience of the earth that we are. And in directing our attention to our weight, we are experiencing ourselves as earth, interacting with the rest of the body of earth. And like any other system, we are in constant contact and constant interaction, earth with earth. And this weight of our body is the expression of the larger body of earth calling us constantly, and our constant answer to that call. When we walk, when we sit, when we lie down, we are the earth communicating with itself. And we are a manifestation of earth, and also that manifestation of earth that wonders about its place in the order of things. We are a manifestation of earth that has spent a long time wondering, and wondering if the order of things can be changed. And the manifestation of earth that are human beings have learned that, yes, the order of things can be changed. And we thought we could change the order of things through the supremacy of our intellect or sheer force of will. And we created hierarchies in which humans are always at the top. but actually we could change the order of things, not because we are a superior species, but because everything is changing all the time. And we humans are the ones supplying the notion of an order of things. We impose structures, structures that say, down below is earth, and I up here am something else. We impose the structure of this is me, and everything else is not me. And that painful structure is not something we simply found in nature. It is the projection of a structure made by our minds. And yet these structures appear to come from outside our mind. Partly because they are not strictly personal. They are collective structures that we have worked out intersubjectively and that we transmit through language. So this order of things that seems natural to us is a product of a collective mind. A collective mind that says, this is us. They are not us. And when we say, this is us, we are calling out other groups who are our others. So we can ask ourselves, what identities are we asserting when we say, this is us? And when we say, that's them, who comes to mind? And what are we doing to them? And what are we doing to ourselves by placing them over there and denying that this is all us? What violence is caused by these structures? And how pointless and avoidable all that violence is when we recognize that those painful structures are not something we simply found out there or that simply exist in the world. They are the projections of a structure born in our collective minds and negotiated through language and images and ideas, and therefore subject to change. And how much suffering could be relieved by dismantling them. Let's take a moment to wonder about that.